Postmodern Condition by Jean-Francois Lyotard. 6. The Pragmatics of Narrative Knowledge. In Section 1, I leveled 2 objections against the unquestioning acceptance of an instrumental conception of knowledge in the most highly developed societies. Knowledge is not the same as science, especially in its contemporary form. In science, far from successfully obscuring the problem of its legitimacy, cannot avoid raising it, with all of its implications, which are no less socio-political than epistemological. Let us begin with an analysis of the nature of narrative knowledge. By providing a point of comparison, our examination will clarify at least some of the characteristics of the form assumed by scientific knowledge in contemporary society. In addition, it will aid us in understanding how the question of legitimacy is raised, or fails to be raised today. Knowledge in general cannot be reduced to science, nor even to learning. Learning is the set of statements which, to the exclusion of all other statements, denote or describe objects and may be declared true or false. Science is a subset of learning. It is also composed of denotative statements, but imposes 2 supplementary conditions on their acceptability. The objects to which they refer must be available for repeated access. In other words, they must be accessible in explicit conditions of observation. And it must be possible to decide whether or not a given statement pertains to the language judged relevant by the experts. But what is meant by the term knowledge is not only a set of denotative statements, far from it. It also includes notions of know-how, knowing how to live, how to listen, etc. Knowledge, then, is a question of competence that goes beyond the simple determination and application of the criterion of truth, extending to the determination and application of criteria of efficiency, technical qualification, of justice and or happiness, ethical wisdom, of the beauty of a sound or color, auditory and visual sensibility, etc. Understood in this way, knowledge is what makes someone capable of forming good, denotative utterances, but also good, prescriptive and good evaluative utterances. It is not a competence relative to a particular class of statements, for example, cognitive ones, to the exclusion of all others. On the contrary, it makes good performances in relation to a variety of objects of discourse possible, objects to be known, decided on, evaluated, transformed. From this derives one of the principal features of knowledge. It coincides with an extensive array of competence-building measures, and is the only form embodied in a subject constituted by the various areas of competence composing it. Another characteristic meriting special attention is the relation between this kind of knowledge and custom. What is a good prescriptive or evaluative utterance? A good performance in denotative or technical matters? They are all judged to be good because they conform to the relevant criteria of justice, beauty, truth, and efficiency, respectively, accepted in the social circle of the knower's interlocutors. The early philosophers called this mode of legitimating statements opinion. The consensus that permits such knowledge to be circumscribed and makes it possible to distinguish one who knows from one who doesn't, the foreigner, the child, is what constitutes the culture of a people. This brief reminder of what knowledge can be in the way of training and culture draws on ethnological description for its justification. But anthropological studies and literature that take rapidly developing societies as their object can attest to the survival of this type of knowledge within them, at least in some of their sectors. The very idea of development presupposes a horizon of non-development, where it is assumed the various areas of competence remain enveloped in the unity of a tradition and are not differentiated according to separate qualifications subject to specific innovations, debates, and inquiries. This opposition does not necessarily imply a difference in nature between primitive and civilized man, but is compatible with the premise of a formal identity between the savage mind and scientific thought. It is even compatible with the premise of the superiority of customary knowledge over the contemporary dispersion of competence. It is fair to say that there is one point on which all of the investigations agree, regardless of which scenario They propose to dramatize and understand the distance separating the customary state of knowledge from its state in the scientific age. The preeminence of the narrative form in the formulation of traditional knowledge. Some study this form for its own sake. Others see it as the diachronic costume of the structural operators that, according to them, properly constitute the knowledge in question. Still others bring to it an economic interpretation in the Freudian sense of the term. All that is important here is the fact that its form is narrative. Narration is the quintessential form of customary knowledge in more ways than one. First, the popular stories themselves recount what could be called positive or negative apprenticeships. In other words, the successes or failures greeting the hero's undertakings. These successes or failures either bestow legitimacy upon social institutions or represent positive or negative models of integration into established institutions. Thus, the narratives allow the society in which they are told to define its criteria of competence and evaluate according to those criteria what is performed or can be performed within it. Second, the narrative form, unlike the developed forms of the discourse of knowledge, lends itself to a great variety of language games. Denotative statements concerning, for example, the state of the sky and the flora and fauna easily slip in. So do deontic statements prescribing what should be done with respect to these same reference, or with respect to kinship, the difference between the sexes, children, neighbors, foreigners, etc. Interrogative statements are implied, for example, in episodes involving challenges. Evaluative statements also enter in. The areas of competence whose criteria the narrative supplies or applies are thus tightly woven together in the web it forms, ordered by the unified viewpoint, characteristic of this kind of knowledge. We shall examine in somewhat more detail a third property, which relates to the transmission of narratives. Their narration usually obeys rules that define the pragmatics of their transmission. I do not mean to say that a given society institutionally assigns the role of narrator to certain categories on the basis of age, sex, or family, or professional group. What I am getting at is a pragmatics of popular narratives that is, so to speak, intrinsic to them. For example, a Kashinahwa storyteller always begins his narration with a fixed formula. Here's the story of, as I've always heard it told, I will tell it to you in my turn. Listen. And he brings it to a close with another, also invariable formula. Here ends the story of the man who has told it to you is. A quick analysis of this double pragmatic instruction reveals the following. The narrator's only claim to competence for telling the story is the fact that he has heard it himself. The current narratee gains potential access to the same authority simply by listening. It is claimed that the narrative is a faithful transmission and that it has been told forever. Therefore, the hero, a Kashinawan, was himself once a narratee and perhaps a narrator of the very same story. This similarity of condition allows for the possibility that the current narrator could be the hero of a narrative, just as the ancestor was. In fact, he is necessarily such a hero because he bears a name, declined at the end of his narration, and that name was given to him in conformity with the canonic narrative, legitimating the assignment of patronyms among the Kashinawa. The pragmatic rule illustrated by this example cannot, of course, be universalized, but it gives insight into what is a generally recognized property of traditional knowledge. The narrative posts are so organized that the right to occupy the post of sender receives the following double grounding. It is based upon the fact of having occupied the post of addressee and of having been recounted oneself by virtue of the name one bears, by a previous narrative. In other words, having been positioned as the diegetic reference of other narrative events. The knowledge transmitted by these narrations is in no way limited to the functions of enunciation. It determines in a single stroke what one must say in order to be heard, what one must listen to in order to speak, and what role one must play to be the object of a narrative. Thus, the speech acts relevant to this form of knowledge are performed not only by the speaker, but also by the listener, as well as by the third party referred to. The knowledge arising from such an apparatus may seem condensed in comparison with what I call developed knowledge. Our example clearly illustrates that a narrative tradition is also the tradition of the criteria defining a threefold competence: know-how, knowing how to speak, and knowing how to hear, through which the community's relationship to itself and its environment is played out. What is transmitted through these narratives is the set of pragmatic rules that constitutes the social bond. A fourth aspect of narrative knowledge, meriting careful examination, is its effect on time. Narrative form follows a rhythm. It is the synthesis of a meter, beating time in regular periods, and of accent modifying the length or amplitude of certain of those periods. This vibratory musical property of narrative is clearly revealed in the ritual performance of certain Kashinahwa tales. They are handed down in initiation ceremonies, in absolutely fixed form, in a language whose meaning is obscured by lexical and syntactic anomalies, and they are sung as interminable, monotonous chants. It is a strange brand of knowledge, you may say, that does not even make itself understood to the young men to whom it is addressed. And yet this kind of knowledge is quite common. Nursery rhymes are of this type, and repetitive forms of contemporary music have tried to recapture or at least approximate it. It exhibits a surprising feature. As meter takes precedence over accent in the production of sound, time ceases to be a support for memory, to become an immemorial beating, that, in the absence of a noticeable separation between periods, prevents their being numbered and consigns them to oblivion. Consider the form of popular sayings, proverbs, and maxims. They are like little splinters of potential narratives, or molds of old ones, which have continued to circulate on certain levels of the contemporary social edifice. In their prosody can be recognized the mark of that strange temporalization that jars the golden rule of our knowledge. Never forget. Now there must be a congruence between this lethal function of narrative knowledge and the functions, cited earlier, of criteria formation, the unification of areas of competence, and social regulation. By way of a simplifying fiction, we can hypothesize that, against all expectations, a collectivity that takes narrative as its key form of competence has no need to remember its past. It finds the raw material for its social bond not only in the meaning of the narratives it recounts, but also in the act of reciting them. The narratives' reference may seem to belong to the past, but in reality it is always contemporaneous with the act of recitation. It is the present act that on each of its occurrences marshals in the ephemeral temporality, inhabiting the space between the I have heard and the you will hear. The important thing about the pragmatic protocol of this kind of narration is that it betokens a theoretical identity between each of the narrative's occurrences. This may not in fact be the case, and often is not, and we should not blind ourselves to the element of humor or anxiety noticeable in the respect this etiquette inspires. The fact remains that what is emphasized is the metrical beat of the narrative occurrences, not each performance's differences in accent. It is in this sense that this mode of temporality can be said to be simultaneously evanescent and immemorial. Finally, a culture that gives precedence to the narrative form doubtless has no more of a need for special procedures to authorize its narratives than it has to remember its past. It is hard to imagine such a culture first isolating the post of narrator from the others in order to give it a privileged status in narrative pragmatics, then inquiring into what right the narrator might have to recount what he recounts, and finally undertaking the analysis or anamnesis of its own legitimacy. It is even harder to imagine it handing over the authority for its narratives to some incomprehensible subject of narration. The narratives themselves have this authority. In a sense, the people are only that which actualizes the narratives. Once again, they do this not only by recounting them, but also by listening to them and recounting themselves through them. In other words, by putting them into play in their institutions, thus by assigning themselves the posts of narratee and diegesis, as well as the post of narrator. There is, then, an incommensurability, between popular narrative pragmatics, which provides immediate legitimation, and the language game known to the West as the question of legitimacy, or rather legitimacy as a referent in the game of inquiry. Narratives, as we have seen, determine criteria of competence and/or illustrate how they are to be applied. They thus define what has the right to be said and done in the culture in question, and since they are themselves a part of that culture, they are legitimated by the simple fact that they do what they do.